The millionaire was about to marry a ruthless woman, until the nanny whispered something to him. The ocean roared that morning like a wounded animal, its waves lashing against the rocks at the base of the cliff with unstoppable fury. From the hill where the imposing Ocean View Grand Hotel stood, the guests barely noticed the background sound, focused on settling into the white and gold decorated ceremony hall. Outside, gray clouds seemed to foretell a storm, but flowers still hung from the balconies. Photographers swarmed seeking perfect angles, and the murmurs of high society filled the air like sweet poison. Today was the day of the most talked about wedding of the year. Richard Alexander, one of the most admired entrepreneurs in Monterey, was marrying Victoria Duval, the woman everyone considered worthy of a fairy tale. He had made his fortune through sheer effort, always surrounded by the pressure of being alone against the world, but had earned everyone's respect. She was the portrait of perfection, elegant, beautiful, seductive, so charming that she could disarm even the most cynical. But while the waves crashed below, an invisible truth was crashing against Richard from within. In his penthouse suite, standing before the mirror, Richard adjusted the knot of his black tie. His reflection showed him an impeccable man, with the deep, serene gaze of someone who seemed to have everything under control. However, within his chest beat a knot of doubts. This was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. Why didn't it feel that way? Victoria had burst into his world at a moment of loneliness, filling the voids with calculated caresses and perfect smiles. With her he had regained hope, or at least that's what he had wanted to believe. But in recent months small details had scratched the surface of his confidence. A cold look when she thought no one was watching, hurtful words toward his nephew Samuel, disguised as corrections, unexplained absences justified with sweet promises. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to quiet his doubts. Not today, not now. Everyone was waiting for him, and he wasn't made to disappoint anyone. On the ground floor, next to the children's lounge, Emma Rodriguez watched everything from the shadows. In a simple dress, hands clasped together, and hair pulled back without pretense, Samuel's nanny sat in a corner of the lobby, with the little boy sleeping in her lap. While the murmur of guests filled the air, her heart beat violently. She had seen it all. She had heard Victoria's threats in the kitchen, had seen how she pushed Samuel on the stairs when Richard wasn't around. That woman's sweetness was just a disguise, and yet who would listen to her? A simple nanny, a humble woman in the midst of a sea of expensive suits and gold watches. Emma looked down at the sleeping child, feeling an uncomfortable warmth rising in her chest. She couldn't let Richard tie himself forever to that facade. Maybe he wouldn't listen to her. Maybe he would despise her for even daring to interrupt his wedding. But it was now, or never. Across the lobby, a waiter announced that the ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. The hotel bells rang solemnly as everyone took their seats in the hall. Emma stood up, left Samuel in his crib, and felt her legs tremble as she took the first step toward the stairs. The red carpet intimidated her, but her heart was firm, because sometimes a whisper is enough to bring down an empire of lies. If this story already has you captivated, don't forget to subscribe right now, so you don't miss the ending. Because this is just the beginning. In the main suite of the Ocean View Grand Hotel, Victoria Duval slowly turned before the mirror, while a couple of assistants adjusted the last folds of her lace dress. The light entering through the enormous windows made her shine like a star, but her eyes didn't reflect tenderness, but a calculated, almost cold calm. She observed her own reflection and smiled, satisfied. She had played her cards to perfection. Every detail of that day had been orchestrated by her from the beginning. She had conquered Richard without him even realizing how easy it had been. A few well-rehearsed tears, and a couple of confidences were enough to win his vulnerable heart, to make him believe she loved him for who he was and not for the fortune he possessed. No one suspected. No one ever suspected. The guests couldn't stop praising her, saying she was the perfect complement to a man like Richard. She smiled sweetly at every comment, tilted her head with feigned modesty, but inside, she was already thinking about what she would do with the Alexander fortune once she sealed that wedding. She knew perfectly well how to get rid of that annoying nephew, and that insolent nanny, who sometimes looked at her too closely afterward. A couple of months would be enough to be left alone with the money and the house on the hill. In another wing of the hotel, Richard walked down the hallway, heading to the staircase that would take him to the altar. The murmur of guests reached there like a distant echo. Every step he took seemed heavier. He remembered the strange gleam in Victoria's eyes when he once surprised her alone, with a glass in her hand and a crooked smile. He remembered the clumsy excuses when he asked her about Samuel's bruises. He remembered the uncomfortable silence that enveloped him every time she looked at him, as if he were a prize she already had secured. But what could he do now? The hall was already full. The cameras were waiting for him. The press was counting the minutes to broadcast the photos live. Who was he to disappoint all those people? However, deep in his mind, the memory of Emma surfaced like a breeze. Emma, the quiet nanny, who always greeted him with a sincere smile, who cared for Samuel as if he were her own son, who looked him in the eyes without expecting anything in return. She had been the only one to look at him as a man, not as a trophy. As Richard slowly descended the first steps on the ground floor, Emma stopped short in front of the door of the suite where he was preparing. Her hands were ice cold, but the decision was already made. She had seen too many things to remain silent. Maybe he would fire her, maybe he would hate her, but at least she would have a clear conscience for having tried to save him. She took a deep breath, pressed her hands against her skirt, and knocked softly on the door. "Yes?" he responded from inside, with a low voice. Emma cracked the door open, letting the light from the suite envelop her. Her heart was beating hard, but her voice was barely a whisper when she dared to speak. "Excuse me, I need to tell you something. It's not easy, but it's important." Richard looked at her with surprise. He didn't expect to see her there, much less at that hour. Something in her expression, the mixture of fear, courage and urgency, made him step back, as if he had sensed that what she was coming to tell him would change everything forever. At that moment, the roar of the ocean sounded louder than ever outside. The door closed behind Emma, with a soft click that sounded louder than she expected. The suite was bathed in golden light that contrasted with her simple dress and worn shoes. In front of her, Richard remained motionless, with his tie half adjusted, his eyes fixed on her, as if trying to decipher what she was doing there. Emma felt the words getting stuck in her throat. For a moment, she wished she could turn back, leave everything, and flee before it was too late. But then she thought of Samuel, of the way the little boy looked at her with tears in his eyes. That time Victoria screamed at him, until he trembled. She thought of the man in front of her, of how he had been trapped in the nets of a woman, who only knew how to fake love. She couldn't stay quiet anymore. She took a deep breath and stepped toward him. Her voice was barely a thread when she finally spoke. "Forgive me, I know I'm no one to interfere, but I can't stay silent. You have the right to know what I've seen." Richard frowned, his gaze still confused, but already tinged with concern. "What are you talking about?" he asked, with a dry voice, as if he feared the answer. Emma looked down for a second, trying to organize her thoughts. Then, one by one she told him about the incidents. The time she found Victoria pushing Samuel, when no one was looking. The whispered threats when she got in her way. The nights when Victoria disappeared for hours to return smelling of another perfume. The words flowed quickly, rushed, as if she was finally freeing herself from a weight too big for her body. Richard listened without moving, with his jaw clenched and his fists closed. Every sentence was like a whip to his chest, and yet he couldn't take his eyes off her. "I have no proof," Emma said at the end, with a thread of voice, "but I swear it. The woman who is about to marry you is not who she says she is." A dense silence filled the suite. Only the roar of the ocean beyond the windows could be heard, now deeper, more threatening. Richard looked away and walked to the window. The wedding hall stretched below like a perfect stage. All the guests were already seated, waiting. Victoria would already be ready, with her impeccable smile, and yet in his mind only, Emma's words resonated. He looked at her again. She was still standing by the door, trembling but with firm eyes, holding his gaze with unexpected dignity. At that moment, Richard felt something inside him break. For the first time in a long time, He didn't know what to do. Emma stepped back, uncertain. She didn't want to pressure him. She had said what she had to say. Now it was up to him to decide. "I'm sorry," she murmured. That was all. And then she turned toward the door, ready to leave. But before her hand touched the doorknob, Richard's deep voice stopped her. "Emma," he said, with a tone that admitted no doubt. "Wait." She remained still, with her back turned, her heart about to explode. Richard breathed deeply, like someone about to jump into the void, and he knew there was no turning back. "I need you to tell me everything, every last detail." The storm had just begun. The silence settled between them, like an invisible wall. Emma remained still by the door, trembling from head to toe, while Richard continued with his gaze fixed on the window, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket. For the first time in years he felt control slipping from his hands. The certainty he had held for months, the conviction that Victoria loved him sincerely, was crumbling under the weight of every word Emma had just confessed. In his mind, images from his past began to mix with recent memories, as if everything was part of the same story he hadn't wanted to see until now. He remembered the loneliness of his childhood, when his mother vanished too soon, and his father, consumed by work, raised him at a distance. He remembered the nights when he stayed waiting for someone to tuck him in, but no one came. Since then he had learned to hide his fears behind an elegant bearing and impeccable success. Years later, when his parents died in an accident, he was left alone at the head of an empire that brought him no comfort at all. It was then that Victoria appeared in his life like a light in the darkness, attentive, seductive, astute in detecting the cracks in his heart. And he, so tired of loneliness, let her in. Now, with Emma's words still echoing in his ears, he realized that that light had been an illusion, that everything had been a lie woven around him, while he was too hungry for affection to see it. Richard leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the window. Below, the hall was already full, the soft music announcing that the ceremony was about to begin. He saw the guests chatting animatedly, the camera flashes, the red carpet waiting for him like a predetermined path to a destiny that suddenly seemed wrong. He turned his gaze toward Emma, who was still there, with her eyes fixed on the floor. There were tears held back in her eyelashes, but there was no fear in her posture. She had spoken with the frankness of someone who had nothing to gain, but also nothing to hide. "Why?" he asked, with a low voice, but loaded with emotion. "Why risk telling me this?" Emma slowly raised her head. She looked him straight in the eyes, with a mixture of compassion and courage. "Because no one else would, and you don't deserve to live deceived, much less harm the child believing this is love." The words pierced him like a knife. Samuel, that little boy he had sworn to protect after his brother's death. Samuel, who took refuge in Emma's arms because he found in her the tenderness that Victoria never gave him. Richard put a hand to his chest and closed his eyes. Suddenly he felt his breathing accelerate, and the weight of his loneliness crush him more than ever. Maybe he had always been alone, even when he thought someone was with him. Maybe he had never really known what love was. He opened his eyes and met Emma's, still firm and transparent. She didn't look away, and at that moment, Richard understood that the decision he was about to make wasn't just about Victoria. It was about himself, about who he wanted to be. Because there are battles one doesn't choose, but still must fight. The murmur from the hall reached the suite. It was the signal. Everything was ready for the groom to appear. Richard straightened his shoulders, adjusted his tie, and took a step toward the door. He looked at her one last time before leaving. "Don't leave," he asked, in a low voice, without a hint of command, just a human plea. "Stay here, please." Emma nodded, and the door closed behind him, with a slight click. The roar of the ocean accompanied him, as he descended toward the hall. The murmur of guests increased when Richard appeared at the end of the hallway. The soft string music filled the hall, momentarily covering the tension that gripped him with each step. Gazes turned toward his tall figure, impeccable in his black suit, his composed countenance as always. In others' eyes, he was still the perfect man, the dream groom. But inside, his mind was a whirlwind. Every word from Emma continued beating in his ears. mixing with the distant roar of the ocean, and the forced applause of high society. They had prepared him for this moment for months, walking down that aisle, smiling at the guests, taking Victoria's hands, and sealing a commitment everyone expected to see. Everyone, except him. The hall benches were covered with white flowers, candles flickered softly in the candelabras, and a sweet dense aroma floated in the air. As he advanced, he noticed details that had previously seemed insignificant. The camera flashes seeking his best angle, the interested smiles of the attendees, the whispers that surely weren't talking about love, but about business, status, and envy. At the back of the hall, standing next to the decorated altar, was Victoria, dressed in white, with a delicate veil that fell like foam over her back, and a perfect bouquet in her hands. She smiled with that sweetness that had hypnotized so many. But now, from that distance, that smile no longer seemed the same to him. There was something cruel hidden behind it, something he could now see clearly, thanks to Emma. Richard walked without stopping, but felt his legs growing heavier with each meter traveled. For a moment he thought of Samuel, up there, perhaps sleeping in the arms of the only person who had always been true to him. And he thought of the child he himself had been, waiting for someone to save him from loneliness. The guests began to stand as he approached the altar. The music changed tone, announcing the imminent arrival of the bride at his side. Everything was too perfect, too calculated. Before climbing the last steps, his eyes drifted to a corner of the hall, and there, among the shadows, he saw her. Emma. She was standing in the back, not daring to sit on a bench, not even daring to move. Her clasped hands betrayed the tremor she was trying to hide, but her gaze was fixed on him, holding him from the distance, like a lighthouse. And for the first time since entering the hall, Richard felt he wasn't completely alone. He stopped for a moment, before going up to the altar, and in that brief silence, Emma's gaze was enough to fill him with determination. Victoria extended her hand toward him gracefully. When she had him in front of her, smiling triumphantly, the justice of the peace looked at both of them with an automatic smile, and the guests sat back down, expectant. Richard breathed deeply as he took Victoria's hand, and felt the metallic coldness of her ring waiting on a nearby tray. Everything was prepared. Everything. But inside, nothing was decided. The justice cleared his throat and began to speak, reciting the ceremony formulas, the litany of words about eternal love, fidelity and devotion. Richard barely heard his hollow phrases. In his mind, only Emma's words, and the sound of the ocean hitting the rocks below resonated. The gazes of the guests surrounded him like blades. The cameras focused on him waiting for his smile, but when he looked up again, he only sought Emma's eyes. She was there, firm, watching him, reminding him that there was something beyond that altar. The justice paused and turned toward Victoria. It was her turn to pronounce the vows, and while she began to recite her perfectly rehearsed phrases, Richard felt his heart beating so hard he could barely hear her, because he knew the real moment wasn't when she spoke, but when it was his turn to say yes. Victoria's words floated in the air like sweet poison, every syllable perfectly modulated, every pause delicate, every gesture carefully rehearsed. She spoke of eternal love, of respect, of unconditional support, and all the guests smiled tenderly as they listened to her, believing in that story as if it were real. Richard watched her from very close, but it was as if he were kilometers away. On his face he maintained the neutral, polite expression that everyone expected of him, but inside, his chest was a battlefield. Every word Victoria pronounced crashed against the recent memory of Emma's confessions, and the contrast between both women became unbearable. He wanted to close his eyes to concentrate, but his eyelids weighed like lead. Then, almost without thinking, he slightly turned his head and searched among the hall benches, and there she was. Emma, still standing in the farthest corner, had remained motionless, with her hands clasped in front of her skirt, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Her simple dress made her invisible to others, but for him, at that moment, she was the only thing shining in the entire room. He looked into her eyes, and she, as if she had been waiting for it, held his gaze without looking away for a single instant. Her eyes offered him no words, no promises, no reproaches, only truth. And at that moment, something loosened inside him, as if his whole life he had been holding onto a lie, and could finally let it go. Victoria finished her speech with a satisfied sigh, drawing soft applause from the guests. She smiled around her with that arrogant confidence that characterized her so much, and took Richard's hand to squeeze it between hers. He barely felt her touch. The justice cleared his throat to call attention, and the words that came next sounded like a shot to Richard's heart. "Richard Alexander, do you accept Victoria Duval as your lawful wife, to love and respect her, in wealth and in poverty, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Absolute silence settled in the hall, the held breath of the guests, the clicks of cameras waiting for his assent, Victoria's impatient smile. Everything stopped. Richard swallowed, and looked down at Victoria's hands. Her fingers were delicate, perfect, and cold as marble. Then he looked up toward the back of the hall, seeking those eyes again, and there they still were. Emma's eyes remained firm, almost pleading, telling him without words that he was still in time, that he could still choose. Richard's heart began to beat faster, stronger, more painfully. He felt the blood in his temples, the cold sweat on his neck, the justice's voice repeating the question in the air. "Do you accept?" The words faded for him. Only two paths remained, the one that would lead him to the empty comfort of always, or the one that would drag him into the unknown. And for the first time in his life, Richard felt he had the right to decide. The murmur of the ocean seeped through the open windows, and in the midst of that roar of waves, Richard clenched his jaw and took a breath. And although he hadn't said it out loud yet, he had already decided. The entire hall held its breath. Not a single voice, not a whisper. The justice waited expectantly, with his gaze fixed on Richard, repeating once more the question with solemn tone. "Do you accept Victoria Duval as your lawful wife?" Richard didn't respond. He felt his hands damp, his neck rigid under the tie, and his heart pounding his chest as if it wanted to escape. In the darkest corner of the hall, Emma looked at him, without blinking. Her eyes seemed to hold him in that abyss, as if she knew that if he didn't do it now, he would never have the courage. Victoria, still holding his arm, leaned toward him, and smiled as if nothing was happening. Her fingers squeezed him hard, too hard for such a sweet smile. For the first time, Richard clearly felt that hidden claw under the silk, the same claw he had chosen to ignore until then. He looked at her carefully. She was beautiful, radiant, the bride everyone envied, but the more he observed her, the more evident the mask became. That smile wasn't of love, it was of triumph, of possession. Images flashed through his mind like lightning. Victoria yelling at Samuel on the stairs, pushing him when she thought no one was watching. Emma crying silently next to the crib, carefully covering the child's bruises. The echo of the nanny's words still thundering in his ears. "The woman who is about to marry you is not who she says she is." He felt his legs firm for the first time all morning. He breathed deeply, and knew the moment had arrived. The words came out of his mouth low, but clear. "No." A murmur ran through the hall like a wave. Some guests covered their mouths, others exchanged incredulous looks. Camera flashes exploded with morbid frenzy. "What?" asked the justice, disconcerted. Richard looked up and repeated calmly, louder this time. "I don't accept." Victoria's hand tensed on his arm, and her smile cracked for a second. She looked at him fixedly, as if she didn't understand, but then after a moment of absolute silence, she tilted her head toward him, and whispered through gritted teeth, "Don't do this." Richard gently pushed her away, removing from himself that pressure that had accompanied him for months. His voice was low, but definitive. "This should never have happened." Victoria looked at him with wide-open eyes, the mask slowly falling in front of everyone. For the first time, in that hall full of luxury, Richard Alexander chose to be free. The murmur of the ocean outside became a roar. In the corner of the hall, Emma felt tears filling her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. Richard turned his head to look for her among the crowd, and there she was, bringing a hand to her chest, with a shy smile trembling on her lips. He returned her gaze, and finally breathed. If this moment has moved you as much as it has me, don't forget to leave your like so we can continue telling stories like this, full of twists and emotion. For an eternal instant, no one in the hall knew how to react. The justice remained still, with the certificate still in his trembling hands, unable to continue. The guests looked at Richard as if he had just uttered blasphemy. Victoria contemplated him fixedly. Her perfect smile shattered into 1,000 fragments. The initial murmur of astonishment transformed into increasingly audible whispers, like a swarm of furious bees. Some of those present shook their heads, others looked at him with disguised compassion, and the most cynical raised their phones to capture the scene. But Richard didn't hear them. He only had eyes for her. There was Emma, still standing in the darkest corner of the hall, with her hands clenched on her skirt, tears trembling in her eyelashes. Her gaze was a balm in the midst of the storm, a silent promise that he wasn't alone. And for the first time in his life, Richard felt he owed nothing to anyone but himself. Victoria, however, didn't take long to react. She dropped her bouquet, and let it fall to the ground with a dry thud. Her face contracted into a grimace that had nothing sweet or delicate about it. It was pure rage. The perfect woman of high society, the most envied bride in the city, showed her fangs. "What do you think you're doing?" She spat through her teeth, loud enough for everyone to hear. Richard didn't respond. He looked at her with a calm that infuriated her even more. "You have no idea what you're going to lose, Richard." Her voice rose in tone, shrill, tearing through the hall's silence. "You need me. You're a lonely, empty man, and without me you'll go back to being the miserable person you've always been." A stifled murmur ran through the guests. Some looked away. Others began to understand, finally, what was really happening. Victoria advanced a step toward him and pushed him with her hands, losing any vestige of elegance. The cameras flashed, phones recorded every second while she screamed, while her rage overflowed, and her words became daggers. "You're a coward, Richard Alexander, a coward who doesn't know what love is. And you," she screamed, turning toward Emma, who was still there motionless, "you're to blame for all this." Emma took a small step back, surprised by the fury falling on her, but didn't look away. Richard then spoke, and his voice resonated in the hall like thunder. "Don't address her again." His tone was cold, cutting, definitive. "Don't." Victoria looked at him with incredulity. Tears of rage streaked her makeup, ruining the face she had perfected for years. Silence again took over the hall, while Richard returned a gaze full of compassion and finality. "It's over, Victoria." The last words were almost a whisper, but sufficient for everyone to hear them. Richard stepped away from the altar, left the ring he would never place on his finger on the tray, and walked slowly toward the hall's exit. Every step was an act of freedom. Every murmur around him faded like sea foam, and upon reaching the door, before crossing the threshold, he turned once more to look for Emma. She was still there with her heart beating in her throat, looking at him as if finally someone had heard her voice. Richard extended his hand to her, barely a subtle gesture, but loaded with meaning, and she took a step forward. The hall doors slowly closed behind Richard's back, muffling the murmurs and flashes that still followed Victoria, still standing at the altar, with the bouquet on the ground, and rage twisting her face. For a second it seemed she would try to compose herself, raise her chin, and pretend to everyone that nothing had happened. But the whole silence was too heavy, and the gazes that once envied her now pierced her with a mixture of pity and scorn. A photographer lowered his camera, uncomfortable, while the first guests began to whisper among themselves, some even standing and heading toward the exit. No one dared to completely break the tension, but everyone already knew that Victoria's perfection had died at that moment, in front of all of them. The justice, confused, closed the certificate book, and stepped back, leaving Victoria alone in the center of the altar. The perfect bride remained motionless, with her makeup smeared, tears mixed with her fury, and her hands clenched at the sides of her dress. Her breathing was quick, labored, like a cornered animal. Finally, she let out a dry scream, loaded with frustration, and kicked the bouquet with a violent gesture. "Damn you, Richard Alexander!" Her voice broke. "You're going to regret this." but no one was paying attention to her anymore. One by one, the guests began to move away, unable to bear more of that spectacle. The empty chairs and lit candles seemed to mock her defeat. For the first time, Victoria was alone, really alone. On the other side of the doors, in the dimly lit hallway, Richard stopped next to the railing. He rested his hands on the wood and closed his eyes, letting out air as if he had just freed himself from an invisible chain that had kept him bound for too long. The roar of the ocean below seemed louder than ever, as if the entire world was reminding him he had made the right decision. He heard soft steps behind him. He turned slowly, and there she was. Emma. In her simple dress, hands pressed against her skirt, hair somewhat loose from the tension of the moment. Her eyes were still moist, but now they had a different shine, more serene. Richard looked at her in silence for a moment. Everything that had been confusion in his chest during the morning was now clarity. He didn't need more words to know that she was the only one who had truly been by his side, the only one who had had the courage to show him the truth, the only one who had cared for Samuel as if he were her own blood. She looked down, as if fearing she had gone too far. But before she could speak, Richard took a step toward her. "Thank you," he said simply, with a low voice but loaded with gratitude. "For not letting me stay blind." Emma looked at him, surprised, and for the first time since they had known each other. Richard smiled at her, not the cold smile he used with the rest of the world, but a warm, true human one. He extended his hand. Emma hesitated, but finally took it. The hotel bells rang above, as if announcing the end of a farce and the beginning of something new. Richard looked at her calmly. "Now let's go see Samuel." Emma nodded, feeling for the first time in a long time that her heart was filled with peace. And together, they began to walk toward the stairs, leaving behind the lights, the murmurs, the broken masks, and the cold marble of the hall. The cold evening breeze enveloped them as soon as they crossed the door leading to the hotel's outdoor terrace. Outside, the ocean's roar dominated every corner, imposing itself over the muffled murmur that still floated from the hall. The sky was covered with purple and gray clouds, and seagulls cut through the air like white arrows, slicing through the silence. Richard leaned on the railing, letting the wind dishevel his hair and cool his temples. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling for the first time in months that he could fill his lungs without the weight in his chest suffocating him. Beside him, Emma stood a few steps back, not daring to look at him directly. For a few moments, neither said anything. The ocean filled the space between them with its wild music, as if both needed to remember how small they were before immensity. Richard broke the silence first, without taking his gaze from the horizon. "I always thought that it was enough to do the right thing." His voice was low, almost to himself. "Work hard, be respectable, give everyone what they expected of me. And when Victoria came, I convinced myself she was part of that. One more piece to complete the perfect image." His gaze lost itself in the waves, in their foam breaking against the rocks. But she wasn't. He let out a slight bitter laugh. "None of that was real. Not her. Not even myself." Emma looked at him, moved by the unexpected fragility of that man. Everyone saw as indestructible. She finally took a step toward him. "What's real?" she said in a low voice, barely audible over the ocean's roar. "Is never perfect, but it's worth it." Richard looked at her for the first time since they went outside. Her eyes had a softness he didn't remember seeing in anyone else, a tenderness that hurt him and healed him at the same time. "You opened my eyes, Emma." His words were sincere, loaded with a weight that was finally lifting. "You showed me what no one had the courage to tell me." Emma looked down, feeling the heat rise to her cheeks. "I just did what I felt I had to do." Richard tilted his head, as if the gratitude weighed on him. "Even so, you did it for me." There was a moment of silence, and then slowly, he extended his hand toward her. Emma hesitated for a second, but finally intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the unexpected warmth of his contact. "Thank you," he murmured. "For me." The waves broke harder below, as if the ocean itself celebrated that confession. Emma raised her eyes to him and smiled, a shy but genuine smile. And for the first time, Richard knew he was exactly where he should be. The sun began to hide behind the clouds, tinting the sky a muted red. In silence, they remained standing there, side by side, with the ocean as their only witness, because not all stories need words to begin. The ocean's murmur continued at their feet, when a small figure appeared on the terrace, interrupting the silence. Samuel, the boy, ran forward through the threshold with his arms extended toward Emma. She immediately crouched to receive him, hugging him tightly, while tears escaped from her eyes. Richard watched them in silence, with a knot in his throat. The child hid his face in Emma's neck, and then looked up at him, as if seeking something in his eyes. In that childish gaze, full of trust and hope, Richard saw what he hadn't known how to see before, that what he most needed in his life wasn't perfection, nor status, nor the empty approval of a crowd. It was love, real love. With slow steps, he approached the two and, without thinking too much, surrounded both with his arms. Emma tensed at first, surprised, but soon let herself be enveloped in that warm embrace, with Samuel in the middle, small and innocent, like a bridge between them. Richard closed his eyes, and for the first time in years felt peace. The tenderness of that moment swept away all the poison Victoria had left behind. The murmurs no longer mattered, nor the newspaper headlines, nor the unmet expectations. Only that improvised little family mattered. The warmth of those bodies together under the salty breeze, the certainty of having chosen with his heart. Emma looked at him, with tears still in her eyes, but a frank smile on her lips, and he knew he didn't have to promise anything grandiose, that he didn't need to rush to define what had just been born between them, because the best things don't arrive with noise, but with whispers. The wind tore white petals from the hall, which flew to the terrace and settled around them like a rain of flowers. Richard watched them fall and knew it was a good omen. Beauty persisted, even after the storm. He pressed Samuel against his chest and squeezed Emma's hand a little tighter. "Home," he murmured with a small smile. "Let's go home." Emma nodded, and together, the three of them began to walk away toward the stairs, while the sky was tinged with orange and violet, and the waves continued breaking below, tireless. Because sometimes a single whisper is enough to bring down an empire of lies, and to build in its place a life worth living. If you felt the power of this story, subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing tales this intense and exciting.